Nicole and Bibi, people might remember, the two sisters, two black women who were sisters, who were partying on the heath. And again, I think women should have the right to go partying on the heath at whatever time of night and not to be assaulted, who not only were killed, but when the police arrived, one of the police officers took selfies with the bodies and shared them on social media. It's worth remembering that when people think that this is what happened to Sarah Everard is some kind of isolated case. What was the police response when Sarah Everard was first killed? It's worth thinking back to that, actually, because you kind of forget that when it was alleged that the person who had killed her was a police officer, and the women wanted to, local women wanted to have a vigil for her, what was the response of the police? The response of the police was to ban the vigil and to tell them they couldn't have one. They used COVID laws, but all sorts of other things were going on. 5,000 people then turned up anyway to the vigil. What was the response of the police to that? The response was to attack the vigil quite brutally. People will have seen the picture of the woman with ginger hair on the floor being assaulted by the police and so on. What was the police response to that, to when that image was released? Oh, well, several police officers went on Tinder, found the woman and messaged her, making it clear that they were police officers and we know who you are and so on. So this record of intimidation and abuse by women of the police is not just a matter of the person who killed Sarah Everard. And of course, as more details came out, we got the ridiculous advice from the police, didn't we? You know, that if someone approaches you claiming to be a police officer, you should ask for their warrant. Well, that wouldn't have helped Sarah Everard because he showed his warrant. You should ring the police, which hardly sounds like something that most women are going to be able to do in the situation in which they are attacked. You should shout for help, knock on a door, hail a bus, assuming all of these things are, within shouting distance of where you happen to be attacked and so on. In other words, completely useless advice that put the onus on the woman, topped perhaps by the comment of the North Yorkshire Police Commissioner, Philip Allott, who said, women, first of all, need to be streetwise about when they can be arrested and when they can't be arrested. And Sarah Everard should never have been arrested and submitted to that. Absolutely disgraceful, essentially blaming the women for being assaulted. And, I think subsequently he was forced to resign, really. But if it hadn't been for all the outrage at what he'd said, he would have been imposed. And this is somebody who was very high up in the police force. In other words, people with these opinions have been allowed to rise to the very top of the police force. And of course, what's come out since has been that Cousins himself had a history of sexual abuse and misogyny, that he was known as the rapist by colleagues, that he exposed himself in a McDonald's 3 days before the killing, that since the killing there have been 12 notices of allegations of police misconduct during investigations against Cousins prior to Everard's murder. Now, bizarrely, some people's response to discussing the question of women's safety has been to call for more bobbies on the beat, better resources for the police and so on, because after all, don't most of them really keep us safe? This is what, it's that general picture of the police, isn't it, really, that led the witness to Sarah Everard getting in the car and being arrested to think that she must have done something wrong. And it's perhaps also summed up by the, I don't know what to call it really, kind of understatement of the year of Cressida Dick, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, person in charge of the police in London, saying, occasionally I have a bad one. What I really want to argue is that the police are institutionally sexist, racist and corrupt, that they are part of a state system that upholds society based on the exploitation of working class people, the oppression of women and black people and immigrants and LGBT plus people and so on. So let's look a little bit at some of the evidence about that and why that might be the case and what therefore the solution might be to the question of violence against women. So on the question of sexism, I don't know how many people had a chance to see the Channel 4, I think it was a Dispatches programme last week that looked at the question of the police and allegations of sexual misconduct against the police. They looked at 514 proven cases of sexual misconduct. They found that the most common was abuse of position for sexual purposes. This involved targeting, in particular, women victims of domestic violence, sexual abuse or trauma. In other words, extremely vulnerable women who had turned to the police for help, that they formed sexual relationships with those women, that they, for example, would steal intimate images from their phones and circulate them on social media and so on. And this wasn't just like, you know, random rogue officers. 15% of the incidents involved police officers of the rank of sergeant or higher. That exposed the fact that of the reports of domestic abuse by officers of the police, in other words, they were the ones that were guilty of the domestic abuse or being accused of the domestic abuse. In 3/4 of the cases, no action whatsoever was taken. That in Scotland, out of 166 sexual misconduct allegations over the last 4 years, there has not been a single dismissal of a police officer for that reason. And the other thing that was seen clearly on the programme was women who worked in the police force, who said that when they came forward to report harassment, that they were not believed, that they found themselves targeted, ostracised, transferred to other departments, and so on. And people may have seen the quotes from Sue Fish, who I think was in charge of the Nottinghamshire police force that had attempted to deal with the question of sexism in the police force. And she talked about, quote, a macho, testosterone-fueled sexism and misogyny within the police force. The ex-deputy commissioner at the Metropolitan Police, Brian Paddick, who is now a Liberal Democrat Lord, said that there was, quote, widespread sexism with the police. This is from their own mouths. You know, these are senior officers within the police force talking about what the environment is like. And that's now, we're not talking about a long time ago. And the fact is that police officers feel that they can commit abuse and know that they can get away with it. And when Cressida Dick says that everybody in the Metropolitan Police feels betrayed by Wayne Couzens and what he did, that they are shocked and outraged, then I think you have to ask the question, really? Why wasn't anything done before then? Loads of people knew. Look at those 12 allegations of misconduct into allegations against him. That's a dozen allegations. For each of those allegations, several people knew something about him. That's dozens of people. Why wasn't anything done? Looking at the figures from the Channel 4 Dispatches programme, why are the guilty cops still in place? It's very hard to believe that the whole of the police force is shocked and feels betrayed when that sort of behaviour has been allowed to go unpunished within the police force. And of course, it's not just the police force. You look at other aspects of the state system, the courts, the judiciary, people will know around questions of rape convictions and so on, how difficult it is. In actual fact, 2019 to 2020 had the lowest level of rape convictions, despite a rise in reported rapes. Of 52,000 rapes recorded by the police, think about that figure, by the way, over a year, that's 1,000 a week. In England and Wales, only 843, that's 1.6%, resulted in a charge or a summons. And you still find cases where victims are asked what they were wearing, or it is referred to what they were wearing, or whether or not they were drunk and so on, as if women themselves were somehow to blame. And of course, we also know that the state is not beyond abusing women for its own ends. If you remember the report into the Spy Cops incident, that when the state have wanted to get information on trade union activists or political activists in various campaign groups and so on, that they sent undercover cops in, and that those undercover cops then formed relationships with women, including sexual relationships, including fathering children, without revealing who they really were and so on. And we also know that, particularly when it comes to the most vulnerable and women and young people and so on, that the police are willing to turn a blind eye to abuse. If you think about the case of the child sexual abuse case in Rotherham, for example, when the young women came forward to try and explain to the police what was happening to them, they were either not believed or it was felt that they were somehow colluding in what was happening to them, that they were happy with it because they were having sex with these men, or it was their fault if they were sleeping with lots of men. Never mind the fact that these were young teenagers sleeping with, you know, with older men and so on. That all of those things really contribute to a picture within the police force which is institutionally sexist. And I also briefly want to refer to the institutional racism and corruption of the police force, because in 1997, the Macpherson report into the murder of Stephen Lawrence labelled the police as institutionally racist. Now, that was 1997. More recently, the Runnymede Trust has produced a report which shows that black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people, despite only 4% of stop and search cases ending in an arrest. In other words, it's not about catching criminals, it is about harassment, and it is black people who get the harassment. A recent Institute of Race Relations report said the pandemic was a golden ticket to harass black people. One author said, despite being central to the government's handling of the pandemic, policing too often threatens rather than protects public safety, particularly people of colour. And we also saw more recently the report into the 1987 murder of private investigator Daniel Morgan, which labelled the police as, and their quote, institutionally corrupt. Stories of police hanging around with gang members, informers, ex-criminals, handing over envelopes of money, returning firearms and drugs that could be sold on, and the police officers getting a share of the profits and so on. And as with the reports of sexism, any officers who reported corruption were ostracised or transferred to another force. So it's not just one bad apple. It is a litany of sexism, racism, greed and corruption within the police force. Why is the police force like that? Well, it's a myth that the police exist to protect us all equally and to ensure that we are all treated fairly. They exist to protect the wealth of the few at the expense of the rest of us. They're actually quite a recent institution. They were brought into being in the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, in response to large protests of workers. When it came to a kind of, smaller or peasant revolts or things like that, the ruling class had a number of measures at their disposal to try and keep people down. In particular, they used the army. Some people had private forces working with them and so on. They used things like public hangings, mass transportations to Australia and so on, various ways of trying to get the ringleaders and crush the revolts. But as you began to get the growth of a larger working class in the cities, in the factories that were, and the mills and so on that were developing, they really found it harder to cope with the larger numbers of protests and the ability of the protests to spread. People famously will probably be aware of the Peterloo massacre that took place in Manchester just over 200 years ago, when the cavalry charged and killed working class people demonstrating for their rights, including women and children, and so on. And that created, quite a furore. And then when you had the Chartist movement developing later in the 19th century, with mass protests and so on, this became a different phenomenon that the ruling class felt that they couldn't put down just by literally butchering people and relying on the army. The problem with relying on the army, which is that was what they were trained to do. They were trained to kill people, to ride into crowds with cutlasses swinging and muskets and so on. And a number of the, I hesitate to say more enlightened members of the ruling class, I wouldn't really call them very enlightened, but at least far-sighted in terms of thinking that if we keep treating people like this, these protests are going to spread from factory to factory, from city to city, and so on, and said that really we need a force that can go in there. There's a good quote in an old Audrey Farrell book, which I would encourage people to try and get hold of a copy of if you want to know about the history of the police, where they talk about how, when the soldiers go in, they need 2 hands for their muskets or their cutlasses and so on, whereas a policeman with a truncheon and a hand free to grab people out of the crowd means you don't kill people and risk producing martyrs. I'll give you the name of the book in a minute. I've seen the message in the chat there. Risk producing martyrs, and B, you can arrest people and drag them out of the crowd. And that literally is what the police force did. That was their role. from the Chartists to the Great Unrest to the General Strike to the 1970s industrial unrest to the 1984-85 miners' strike, that has been the role of the police. They're not just workers in uniform, because workers have an interest in getting together and fighting for their rights. The police, by contrast, are trained to see large groups of working class people as a threat. Think about the way they treated football fans at Hillsborough, for example, and continue to treat football fans to this day. If people don't know about that, they can ask in the discussion. They are trained to look with suspicion at anyone who fits the stereotype of a criminal. That might involve racial stereotyping when it comes to gangs or terrorism and so on, but it's never going to be the boss in the flash suit and the fancy apartment who might be not paying their taxes or running an unsafe workplace, breaking the Health and Safety Act, and so on and so forth. That's not what they see as crime. It's these stereotypes. They spend their time enforcing racist and sexist laws and practices, whether that's immigration laws, whether it's, well, I was going to say historically, the question of prostitution, which they have policed in terms of the way that women should behave and how they should be out in public and so on. But actually, they still do it to this day. Harass women on the streets. If it's a woman who is a prostitute, demanding sexual favours of them and so on, that is something that still goes on to this day. Think about the suffragettes and the way they treated the suffragettes. The idea that the police are violent towards women is nothing new. They would arrest and beat up the suffragettes. They would drag them to prison. They would force feed them, and so on. When it comes to the so-called, rights of husbands in domestic violence cases, because only in 1992 that rape within marriage was actually made an offence. That the police actually have repeatedly, turned a blind eye and so on. In other words, they are enforcing the views of the ruling class about how the working class people should behave, and all of that shapes their outlook. Can they protect us from violence and crime? Well, firstly, they're really rubbish at solving crime. If I was in an in-person meeting, I would be asking you now to call out what you think the percentage of actual crimes that the police solve is. But in the 12 months to March 2020, they solved 7.8% of crimes reported to the police. In less than 10%, in other words. They didn't even make double figures. And usually, well, when I say solved, it resulted in someone being charged or summoned. And usually that's when they know who the perpetrator is to start with, because they're caught red-handed or whatever, or because somebody informed on them. Hardly any of it is the sort of detective work that you see on TV. It's not the police running down the road shouting, stop police and stuff like that. That's not what the police spend most of their time doing. They spend most of their time sitting around, getting bored, maybe sitting in a car, waiting for a call so they can stick the blue light on and go and chase somebody and cause more violence, because it's actually known that that's a major contributor to violence in car chases with the police and so on. So firstly, they're rubbish at solving crime. Secondly, when it comes to the question of violence, especially violence against women, it's not just that sometimes the police are the perpetrators, but if you look at the nature of violence against women, actually, despite the high-profile cases, the majority of it happens inside the home. And the rate of deaths of women at the hands of current or former partners has remained at 2 per week for a very, very, very long time. It's a very damning statistic of society. The Centre for Women's Justice put a super complaint to Her Majesty's Inspectorate of the Constabulary, and its report confirmed that the criminal justice system is failing to function effectively when responding to domestic abuse. Despite the Domestic Abuse Act of 2017, prosecutions collapsed from 18%, it's a rubbish figure anyway, in 2017 to 9% in 2020. Protection orders only used in 1% of domestic abuse crimes, and restraining orders in less than a quarter of domestic abuse prosecutions. This led the director of the Centre for Women's Justice to say, "It is no wonder that women came out in droves to protect the lack of safety afforded to women by the criminal justice system following the murder of Sarah Everard." This report highlights some of the reasons why so few women feel confidence in the system. So the police and the courts are part of the problem. What is the solution, especially to the question of violence against women? Well, there are some first steps that you can do. Firstly, let's sack every police officer with a sexual misconduct conviction against them. That would be a good start. Get them off the streets. Oppose any extension of police powers or calls for more police on the street, because this will just result in more harassment. Things like better sex and relationships education in schools for boys and girls, which many teachers have campaigned for, but which is repeatedly being cut in the drive of the education system to focus on, particularly for working class people, the basics of literacy and numeracy and so on. Let's do something to tackle poverty wages and poor housing, things that contribute to extra stress within the home, but also make it harder for women in particular to leave violent households and set up by themselves. Let's reverse the cuts in mental health support, which would help some of these issues. All of these things are things that we should demand. But really, we need more than that, because our society encourages violence against women in two major ways. Through the family, it enforces a stereotype, reinforced through the media, of women as essentially passive, while men are dominant, naturally aggressive, unable to resist their sexual urges, and so on. In other words, sexism is deliberately reinforced at the top of society because women's role in the home enables the smooth running of society. It does that in all sorts of ways, of preparing the next generation of young workers to go and get exploited in the workplaces and so on. It also provides ideological ballast for the system, the way in which the ruling class are always going on about the importance of the family. If things go wrong, it's because we weren't good enough at providing a stable family home and so on. Secondly, sex is treated not as something that is connected with emotion, consideration, empathy and trust between human beings, but as a commodity. That's especially true of women's bodies used to sell cars and so on. The objectification of women means that some men see sex with women as something that can be bought or simply taken. And these two things really mean there's enormous pressure on the family as people are encouraged to see it as some kind of ideal that rarely fits reality, as many struggle to cope with everyday life and find themselves trapped within that situation. Changing the way, so, for us, we have to think about changing the way that women and sex are seen at every level of society. And that means reimagining how we care for the young, the old and the sick in a more collective way, and at the same time freeing sex from the commodification of capitalism. Every step of the opposed by all the forces of the state, including the police, because they are there to defend the status quo. But we do have a bigger force on our side, and that's the very reason that the police force were created in the first place. The power of a united, organised working class, which has an interest in overcoming the exploitation and oppression at the heart of society and fighting for a better society. But that, comrades, is a different meeting, so I will stop there. Thank you. I just want to, first of all, just a couple of quick things. I was sent a message in the chat saying that somebody wanted to know about the show I mentioned at the beginning, which I presume is the Channel 4 Dispatches programme. It was called Cops on Trial, and it was aired, I think, a week last Monday. So you can probably find it on catch up on whatever the Channel 4 catch up one is called, More 4 or whatever it's called. But it was called Cops on Trial. By the way, somebody also sent me a private message. I think it was Rose during the talk about Prince Andrew and how they're not interested in prosecuting him. And I think that's a very good point to make, actually, because it does show the way in which these attitudes go right to the very top of society and the way in which they are prepared to defend their own, and they don't really give a damn about the rest of us. So I think that's a very good point to make. Rose also sent me a message about patriarchy theory, which I may have time to come back to a bit later. But I think I guess a lot of the main points really that I wanted to come back to are around the question of how can we feel safe? How can we make ourselves feel safe? What can we do to be more safe, given that we don't have confidence in the police and so on? And can we reform the police, and what sort of changes do we need? I mean, I think people, Karen and Vanessa and people have come back on that on some of those points really well about how there is that thing about how you feel as an individual and what you can do and what you can do collectively. And that whilst there are no really quick fixes, I think a lot of what we can do, if we approach it in a way that is about being a collective, which is a way that makes us feel a little bit stronger. And that's not just about waiting for the big changes in society to happen, but how can we organise around things like better transport, better lighting, better housing, you know, people who live on big housing estates with dark corridors and things like this, you know, anything that you can do collectively to try and campaign around those kinds of issues automatically starts to make you feel, I think, a little bit stronger. And of course, the onus shouldn't be on us, should it? It should be on, you know, what can we also do as a society, which then raises a lot of bigger questions, really, about what sort of society we would like. Like, one of the things that I think, however, if we're talking about the question of the police, is that demands around things like better transport, lighting and housing are demands that we can organise around collectively as a class, if you like, as you know, as the less well-off in society, that we should make demands on the government and the people that run society for these things. But there are other demands that I think you know, can end up, which a lot of people fall into when it comes to demands around the law and around the police and so on, that actually end up giving more power into the hands of the people who actually conspire against us when we try and fight back. And that's where I think we have to be a little bit careful. I agree with what Helen said, actually. I mean, the question of hate crime, yes, of course, why shouldn't misogyny be a hate crime? You know, women's oppression is a real thing in the same way as in the same way that racial oppression is. By the way, I mean, there was a phone in on Radio Manchester, I think it was yesterday, and they were saying, should assaulting people who work in public places, like you know, shopkeepers and cab drivers, people who interface with the public, should that be a hate crime? And I was thinking, well, that really undermines what you mean by a hate crime, because hate crimes are about recognizing that this particular oppression exists within society, which is true of racial oppression, LGBT oppression, and is true of women's oppression. So I wouldn't be in favour of kind of diluting that idea. But I think when it comes to misogyny, yes, why shouldn't we recognise that misogyny is a real thing in society? However, it will make no difference to the instances of hate crime and within society. Unfortunately, that is the experience. I gave you the figures around, you know, domestic abuse and so on. The fact that it has now become you know, that we now have a Domestic Abuse Act, that rape within marriage is now accepted as a crime and so on, has not lowered the incidence of those crimes, and nor does prosecuting them more sharply. If you look in America, for example, the states where they have the death penalty for rape does not reduce the incidence of rape. These are more fundamental questions about how society works, and I agree about, I mean, and when you were saying injected, I don't know if you meant about the spiking of the drinks, you know, but I'm against, you know, more searches and so on, which will only be used to harass certain people in those situations. I'm for looking at what you can do about the environment within the clubs and pubs to make people feel to make people feel safer, in terms of who is employed in them, you know, how crowded they are, and whether there are spaces that people can go, places that people can talk to. I know some pubs and clubs have a thing where you can go up and ask for a certain name. In other words, you can, without letting everybody know, make it clear that you are worried and that you need some kind of support. So, you know, I think clubs can be a lot more amenable to women in that, be a lot more amenable to women in that sense, and we should demand those changes. But anything that gives more powers to the police, I think, would ultimately be used would ultimately be used against us. And the question then comes when you're talking about the police, about whether or not they can be reformed. You see, I think it's very, very problematic. You know, the police will try and change the sorts of language they use and all the rest of it, and you know, they've got these nice centres now where they can take domestic abuse victims. They've kind of learned from the days when they would automatically assume the woman was lying, subject her to intense interrogations. None of these things have made any difference, either to the incidence of those attacks taking place or to the rate at which people are convicted, to the rate at which people are convicted. And we've seen by, you know, the attitudes that I talked about and the figures that I gave at the beginning, that it also hasn't fundamentally made any difference to the attitudes of the people who join the police, certainly of those who stay in it for any length of time, and of those of it who rise to the top. So I don't think, actually that the police force can be reformed, because they are there to uphold a system that is at its heart racist, sexist and corrupt. And therefore we need to talk more widely about both how we change that system, and within that actually what would that mean for the question of policing ourselves. And here I think we can actually look on the bright side a little bit, because if you look around the world, every time you see mass resistance, you see women at the heart of it. If you look at the recent spates of uprisings there have been in Chile, in Hong Kong, in Somalia, you always see on your screens pictures of young women standing on cars, chanting, often in countries where in the past they would have been been very reluctant to have been seen behaving in that way in public. In other words, that atmosphere of resistance and fighting back pushes women to find a new sense of confidence. But it doesn't just do that. If you look at things like, people might remember the big uprisings in Egypt in 2011, and they occupied Tahrir Square in the center of Egypt. And women would always report about how they would feel unsafe walking across that square. They would constantly be attacked, be harassed by men. But actually, when people rose up and said, this is our square, we're taking over this square, actually they policed themselves. They made sure that women weren't harassed in that space. They protected people from different ethnicities and religions when they wanted to say their prayers and so on, in a situation where people have been harassed and oppressed before. In other words, when people start to fight back, all the rubbish that they might have had and that they might have listened to and that might have controlled their lives in the past gets thrown off, and you find a new sense of community, and people actually start behaving better towards each other. And we might be a long way from those big uprisings, but actually every little fight back improves our confidence and the ability of our side, and makes us stand a little bit taller, and makes people who want to behave badly towards us feel more reluctant to do so, because they know that we as a community are saying that it's not acceptable. Not that a bunch of people in uniform with truncheons and handcuffs are saying it's not acceptable, but we as a community are saying it's not acceptable. And I think that gives us a glimpse of what a different sort of society might be like, actually, and how when you get rid of all of those rotten ideas that come from the top, and you get rid of the economic deprivation, the poor housing, the lack of prospects, and all the things that make people turn inwards on each other and feel insecure. When you get rid of that, I actually think people will police themselves in a much better way. And I'm going to finish with a quote that's at the end of the book by Audrey Farrell, and it's actually a quote from Engels. And he talks about that sort of society where people freed from capitalist slavery, from the untold horrors, savagery, absurdities and infamies of capitalist exploitation, people will gradually become accustomed to the observation of the elementary rules of social life. They will become accustomed to obeying them without force, without compulsion, without subordination. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves that there is a better society out there that we can fight for, and that should be a big takeaway, because women will be central in that fight, and they will stand tall and fight back, and we can fight for a better kind of society. Thanks.